Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's Modern Member webinar. Just a couple of housekeeping issues before we start. I've posted the registration link in the chat box. If everyone that's attending this webinar can please fill in that form for us so that we know that you attended and we can recognize you from that. Guys, also, it's always great if we can switch on our cameras. It also just makes it so much easier for our presenter to see faces in front of them. So if I can ask that we switch on our cameras, that would be absolutely amazing. And then I think without any further ado, it's always great to welcome Rob Arnold. Rob has done so many of our webinars over the last couple of years. He's really done amazing work in our industry, and it's always great to listen to Rob. Rob, welcome, and thank you for doing this for us. Welcome.
Thanks, Charles. I'm getting tired of my own voice, but it's lovely to have everyone on the call this morning. A couple of familiar faces and a couple of new ones as well, which is always great. Ladies and gents, before we get started, I'm going to play a little video for you, a short clip this morning, to get us started, and I think to think in the right direction of what the content today is going to involve.
What you have here is an electronic cigarette. It's something that, since it was invented a year or two ago, has given me untold happiness. A little bit of it, I think, is the nicotine, but there's something much bigger than that, which is ever since in the UK they banned smoking in public places, I've never enjoyed a drinks party ever again. And the reason I only worked out just the other day, which is when you go to a drinks party and you stand up and you hold a glass of red wine and you talk endlessly to people, you don't actually want to spend all the time talking. It's really, really tiring. Sometimes you just want to stand there silently, alone with your thoughts. Sometimes you just want to stand in the corner and stare out of the window. Now the problem is, when you can't smoke, if you stand and stare out of the window on your own, you're an antisocial, friendless idiot. If you stand and stare out of the window on your own with a cigarette, you're a fucking philosopher.
Right, good morning, ladies and gents. I hope everyone could hear that. It's one of my best little videos I've watched in a little while, and it speaks beautifully into what we're going to chat about today, which is something that I think is a gaping opportunity waiting to be taken advantage of in our particular industry, and something that I've seen working immensely well in the different sectors that we work in. Just for those of you not unmuted, Charles, if you wouldn't mind, I think there might be someone having a secondary conversation in the same forum. Cool. So I think one of the things I just wanted to get started on today as we delve into this topic of what the modern member is that the quote that I share with you on the screen this morning is something which we all maybe see in a different way, but I believe is incredibly relevant to us all, and that is that value is not a game of ones and zeros, it's actually a game of perception. And I think what's beautiful, and we'll delve into this shortly, but we've got so many different lenses, so many different perspectives, so many different viewpoints, even on this call this morning, that it would be remiss for us to not apply the same degree of understanding to our member base and those people who we will serve in the future. So just by way of example, what I'm going to ask you to do this morning is in the chat box, I'm going to ask you to give me one word for the type of customer you think you are. So when you walk into a shop, when you walk into a restaurant, when you walk into any place that you are the customer, what would be the one word that you think people describe you as a customer? And I'd like you to be as honest and frank as possible, because I'm pretty sure there are a couple of difficult people. I know one whose surname ends in L-E-Y here, and I know he's not an easy customer. But there are a couple of different ones as well. So just one word, if you would, just in the chat box of how would you describe yourself as a customer? Ruben says understanding. Aaron says polite. Kyle says friendly. Monique, friendly. Oh, Chris, come on, sir. Liam says inquisitive. Paul says considerate. Johan says understanding. Cindy says patient. Jessica says I know what I want. Jessica, I'm with you on that one. Let's not waste any time. Hadza says expecting. Mariska says compassionate. And as is expected, it's interesting, even in this small cross-section of human beings, compassionate being another one, observant being another, is how different we all are. Observant, thanks Candace. How different we all are in how we perhaps describe ourselves. And one of the things which is so important when it comes to perception is that it is so closely linked to the lens through which it is being perceived. And what I mean by that is, Paul says, don't give me on a bad day. Paul, I find that hard to believe. I don't think I've ever seen you having a bad day or being in a bad mood. So maybe I just haven't seen that just yet. It's so interesting being in this business for a while. You see these different people perceiving a club and at a club, and you see literally the same experience or the same value proposition being experienced by two different lenses and a completely different takeout from that. And one of the things I'm going to challenge you all on today, because one of the aspects which has been developing quite quickly at the moment is things like the installation of paddle courts and a lot of infrastructural improvements that are happening within different clubs. And that's always going to be there, and that's always going to happen. But it does beg the question is what really is our competitive difference? What is the unique element that differentiates us between our different clubs, etc.? And this is something which is not as easily understood. With the ones and zeros, we can understand it's an asset of value, but it's not so easily understood when we start talking about the intangibles. And this is kind of an angle which we're going to explore today. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of that, one of the people that I love to follow the most and one of the most interesting people that I've ever listened to on any platform is a guy by the name of Danny Meyer. If you haven't listened to him, I strongly, strongly advocate and suggest that you listen to his work. He was the gentleman who started the Union Square Hospitality Group in New York. Today is one of the most successful operators of any hospitality business ever. He founded something called Shake Shack, which now has become listed and is incredibly successful in its own right. But he also operates a number of fine dining and more high-end restaurants. And one of the terminologies which I've always loved that I'm going to echo as we start this morning, something I've spoken about many years ago, is the difference between being the best in the industry and being someone's favorite. And I just want to revisit this as we start this line of content this morning.
GolfRSA Tavern is 21 years old and remains New York's #1 favorite restaurant in the Zagat survey. And we're really proud of that. I think that when someone says that you are their favorite version of anything, they're paying you the absolute highest compliment they can pay you. No one said GolfRSA Tavern is the best restaurant. No one said Lexus is the best car. We'd like to think we are, and you'd like to think you are. But if somebody says, this is my favorite, that's inarguable. Nobody can say, no, it's not your favorite. And if I say Lexus is my favorite car, it wouldn't be my favorite if it also didn't provide an emotional connection that made me feel awesome.
So just a little clip from a wonderful little video that you could find on YouTube. And it's just something which has always sat with me since the 10 years ago or so that I first listened to it. And for the reason that we have, even on this call this morning, if you look at the cross-section of managers and individuals and clubs represented here, we have got such a cross-section of different value propositions. But at the heart of it, what is so vitally important is that we endeavor to try and be the favorite for the ecosystem that we serve. And again, I'm going to bring this back to you as the customer today. I'm asking you to wear your customer hat for a number of different reasons this morning. But I want you to think back and reflect and think about your journey that you follow on a typical week or typical month. And perhaps whether we know it or not, you have a favorite in your journey, wherever you might go during the course of the week, whatever you might do. It might not be the best, but it probably is your favorite. It might be the coffee shop that you visit on the way to the club. It might be something that you visit or a restaurant that you go to. What I would like to know is, what is that favorite? So I'm going to jump to Eric this morning at Royal. Eric, I can see you chomping at the bit. You're ready to go. Chris has obviously given you more than enough sleep. But I want to know from you, what is your favorite this morning? What is something that you love to do? It isn't defined as the best out there, but it's your favorite. What would that thing be for you, Eric?
Morning, Rob. Yeah, my favorite part of the day, and it's going to sound strange, is coming to work, coming to Royal, because this is the home. This is my favorite place to be. So this is my people, and I'm always just excited. I don't think in the 7 years that I've come to work that I've come to work with a bad feeling or things. I'm just always excited to be here. So it's a good and a bad thing, but yeah, that's how I feel.
Chris just messaged me directly and just said the raise is in the post. So thank you for sharing that this morning. Eric, can you answer me this follow-up question, which is to say, is there a quantifiable reason why it's your favorite thing to do in the day? Is there a logical reason why it's your favorite, or is it just what it is?
No, absolutely. It's the members, the people, and truly the appreciation sometimes that you get. Yes, you get the difficult guy, but in essence, the people that I deal with absolutely show that appreciation for what I do personally. And for me, that's like a motivation just to carry on with it.
Thank you. Right, let's compare and contrast that to another answer. So I'm going to go to I don't know if any of you have ever heard of him, Mr. Leishman. He's at a small place called Bryanston. Good morning, Paul. How are you doing this morning? What's that favorite thing for you to do? And let's try and maybe think of something away from the club or away from work, but maybe you as a customer. What's that favorite for you?
No, I think, Rob, there's obviously, you always love the places where you get great service and that. Something that comes to mind is my Monday morning stop off for coffee for the office team. So Monday, we're generally a smaller team working in the office, and bar restaurant only opens at 10 o'clock. So the guys crave their early morning coffee, and I stop off at the Seattle on the way. And, I only see them every Monday, but, they know your name and the service is incredible. And you normally stand in a bit of a queue because it's a popular place in it. But, that warm feeling you get there, when you get there. And, I mean, you start having little conversations with them. And, I mean, the one lady had a little pin on her that was, had 30 on. And I'm like, what's the 30? And she goes into, she's been working for Seattle now for 30 years. And making coffee at Seattle for 30 years, and you're flipping, get blown away by that somebody can make coffee for 30 years and still have a smile on their face in it. So that's definitely, it's a small little highlight, and I think there's lots of little places like that. So.
And Paul, if I had to ask you to blindfold yourself and put Seattle, Vida, Bootlegger, and a couple of other coffees in a line, do you think, and I'm not having a go at you here because I know what my answer would be, if I had to put those in a line, do you think you'd be able to discern the different types of coffees that were in front of you, or not?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I know it is my go-to favorite. I've tried them all. And I guess it's down to personal taste as well. So I mean,
your palate would definitely be better than mine. That's for sure. Because the reality, I think, is that if you look at it on the mass scale, I think most people can't really tell you the difference between the finite differences in the coffee. But I think sorry, Charles, can you just mute there, please? What I think everyone can discern, and I think funny how you and Eric have spoken about this in different environments, is that it is the energy in the space that often determines the perceived value behind what we create. Yeah. And I think that's something which you can't define. I don't think there is a definition. There isn't a quantum behind that. There might be a perceived rating that you give for it, but you cannot put a quantum behind it, an energy that you feel. Yeah. And I think maybe asking it rhetorically to everyone today is, if you take and thank you for that, Paul. If you take the average energy that exists in your space, and that might be a department within the club, it might be the club in totality, depending on what you oversee. But what is that average energy that exists within this space? Because it's funny how, one of the things that have become a reality for us, and I wanted to share this stat with you this morning, because it's quite remarkable given the scale of it. For those of you who don't know, we've been we've been working in the sort of in the retail space for quite some time. And one of the things we learned by mystery shopping, one of the shopping centers in the Cape called Canal Walk, is over the last 5 years, we've had the benefit of being able to audit every store in the center. And one of the stats, the outcomes that have come out of this, is that for every single store, there is a question that is asked for the first 30 seconds that you are in the space. How are you made to feel, right? 1 or 2 word or 3 word answer. The last question that is asked for every single mystery shop that goes into every store is, what is your likeliness to return? Now, in 5 years, the difference in those 2 indicators has been 0.3%. So you take away the product knowledge of the staff, you take away the upselling capability, you take away all the things that happen in between that space, and you get a 0.3% difference in that result. And what I'm essentially saying is that perception is most importantly created at the outset of when we're in that space. So funny enough, when Paul spoke about being in the line, right? When you're standing in the line, one of the things that a restaurant in the Cape called Willoughby's, that's in the V&A waterfront, started doing so exceptionally well, is that they started noticing that there were bigger and bigger queues being waiting outside the restaurant. And what was happening is that people were starting to leave the queue because they were getting bored and tired and irritated. So what they started doing is they started changing the perception in the queue of what people were doing or how invigorated they felt. And they started serving people in the queue. They started speaking to people in the queue. And if you'll notice at Seattle, what the people are trained to do now is they speak past the first person in the queue. They speak to the third and the fourth person because they're validating that person while they're in the space. Your perception of the space is starting to improve even before you get to the first human connection, which is at being at the front of the queue. So it's very interesting because the question then becomes, how are we capitalizing on these perceptive opportunities throughout our experience? And what we're finding is that the modern customer, whatever you want to term it, is paying more and more value and homage to what those opportunities are and how they've been taken care of. Something which I heard the other day, which I think is absolutely brilliant, and I know some of your clubs have started to do this so well, but I heard this phrase and it said that your club security guards are, in fact, your membership sales executives. And it's funny because you think of a security guard as a functional role. It's not, it's actually a perception role. They're in the business of creating the perception before anything else has happened. They're the first physical point of contact. And to some that may sound obvious, but the reality is if you look at the average level of service, and we've seen this over the last 10 years of security guard service, it's actually not that high. It's a big opportunity that actually gets missed. So what we've started to learn is that if you increase the perception at that point in the customer journey, your basket size actually gets bigger. Your per head spend gets bigger or gets larger because you are starting that person off on a point where they feel validated, where they feel significant, where they feel like they're wanted. And obviously, perhaps more for the visitor so than the member, but the importance stays the same. And I think with all of this in mind, one of the things that becomes incredibly important, and I love this quote from a gentleman by the name of Tony Robbins, a lot of you probably heard of him already, is that where focus goes, energy flows. So as leaders of the organization or as the person who's heading up that department, where your focus goes, the energy will flow. And one of the things we've learned in habit forming is that if you focus a significant or a requisite amount of time on that particular expectation, you've got a better chance of that becoming a habit. But one of the things that become very difficult for staff to kind of adapt to is if we have a focus and say, look, guys, I want you to do X or Y for today or for this week, and then we shift, then that focus becomes sort of dissipatory and it doesn't really become important to them anymore. So we've got to find a way to make sure that the focus on that particular executional practice is something which is reiterated as much as possible. I want to share this next little clip again from Danny, which again, he was speaking more recently at a conference, and he shared this after a question that was posed from the audience. And it's all about how do we create true value? And it's about our place in people's lives. What is our place in the context of the lives of the people that we serve?
We become essential in people's lives when the very fact that we exist makes their lives better. And if we didn't exist, their lives wouldn't be as good. Now you may say, well, that's kind of a lofty goal. I'm just selling stuff. And I would just argue, if you're just selling stuff, you're going to quickly end up in this commodity heap. And we know that from the restaurant business. What we are selling more than anything is a need to belong. We are satisfying people's needs to belong. One of the things we try to tell our team all the time is that, you know, when you get your bill at the end of a restaurant meal and it itemizes all the things that you just ate and drank, and then you get a big number at the bottom. I always tell our team, not the cooks, but pretend if you're the server that 100% of what they were paying for was how you made them feel. That $249 is how did you make them feel? The food was free, the drinks were free. Because the real question is, in terms of someone's interest in coming back to the restaurant, is, as Maya Angelou said many years ago, people will forget what you said and they'll forget what you did, but they'll always remember how you made them feel. And that's what we're all selling.
So what was interesting, and the reason why this again resonated with me so much, is that quite recently back here in the Cape, a friend of mine actually went to a club, which I'm not going to mention, but they went to this club to play as a visitor. And one of the things which struck out at me was the perception of this individual's experience of the club that I'm actually associated to as a member, but at the same time, their experience, their perception of the value proposition and mine are two completely polar opposite sides of the spectrum. And what I was somewhat disheartened by was the fact that as a member, I get a significantly more impressive value proposition or perceived value proposition, whereas this person who should be a potential prospect did not receive that level of experience at various points in the journey. And I think this is something which we need to pay such important attention to, is, again, if we look at the lens of the customer, what is the difference between the different lenses that we serve? Because I believe, and in my experience, a lot of staff see a human being in a certain capacity, and some of the staff are able to discern, for example, between that member expectation and the visitor one, but many of the staff sort of take more of a default approach, or even sometimes, because of a lack of familiarity with the visitor, will almost err on the side of caution rather than seeking to exceed expectation or seeking to make that person feel, as Danny said in that video, feeling like they belong. And this is something which is a behavioral aspect that is so important for us to realize, ladies and gents. This is not a function of skill. This is actually a function of state. It's a function of understanding and being able to see the requirement of that human being. And that is why I say, and you'll see a slide later on, that when I ask you what business are we in, I truly believe that we're in the business not of golf, we're in the business of anthropology. We're not in the club business. We're in the business of anthropology. And what that means is that we're in the business of understanding people, understanding the function and the core and the origins of human behavior. Because when you start to understand that, you start to understand why member so-and-so acts the way he or she does, as opposed to member Y, who has a completely different reaction to the same situation. And the more of our staff that are equipped to understand that, the more agile our experience and our value proposition becomes. So it's important for us to appreciate this, because at the end of the day, you as the leader, you as the manager, should be making yourself more irrelevant in the value proposition, not more relevant. And that's something which we don't often think about, and we think, how on earth could that be, or how, but to a large extent, that is how we become more consistent in what we do. So I truly believe in this, and that creating value is ultimately about influencing state. It's not so much about influencing skill, although skill must always be developed and it must always be at a certain level. What you find in the most significant contributors of value in your space are those people who find themselves in a better state more often. Because ultimately, when it comes to the modern member, they take as much value from the state of the person who's serving them as they do from the actual skill set. For example, if someone is walking around your floor and they are visibly not in the best state, but they are still performing the functional role of their job, they are going to still not be delivering the kind of value that we expect them to deliver. So it's important that we understand how do we influence state as much as possible in our day-to-day dealings. Again, as I'm going to reiterate this because I think it's important from an identity point of view. What business are we in? I believe we're in the business of anthropology. So we're in the business of actually understanding human beings better so that we can become more agile. One of the stats that we've learned in the sort of in the more recent times is the fact that human beings or consumers are becoming more insistent on some form of customization. Yes, technology is helping us to move that way, but there is becoming a greater insistence on, if I'm not feeling a customized element of the service towards me, I don't trust that experience as much. So it's very, very important that we combine the human element with the technology to be able to make that happen. I think one of the focus areas going forward, as I've just mentioned, is the focus on getting more studies and more content aligned to the understanding of human behavior. So in terms of what our teams and what our individuals study, yes, they must always study the technical skill related to their job, and they must be competent in those areas. But what's stopping us from developing more understanding of human behavior and more consumer behavior? And a lot of the stuff can be understood down to quite a fundamental level in terms of those who are even at the coalface of our experience. So I would strongly advise, and what we're seeing outside of the club industry is that we're seeing a lot of the top retailers that we work with starting to invest a lot of money in getting staff to actually learn about anthropology and learn about different types of human dynamics. And they really, really are benefiting from that. One of the skills that you can take note of, which is hugely benefiting basket size at the moment, is something called curious intelligence. So what curious intelligence is it's the natural propensity to want to understand who's in front of me a little bit more deeply, right? So what makes consumer A different from consumer B? And what you interestingly find is that the natural behavior that flows from there is more questions. And if you look at the recent studies, more questions actually lead to bigger spend, because the more that the consumer is speaking, the more that they're conscious in the moment. So think about yourselves quickly as a customer, ladies and gents. Monique, if you think about yourself as a customer, what you'll actually find is that the more that you talk in an experience, the more that you'll have conscious memory of that experience, and actually the more that you'll see value in said experience. Whereas if you are listening, for example, to a waiter or to a staff member, whoever it might be, and they're just rattling off things to you and you're nodding your head and you're pretending to remember everything that you were told, you're actually not taking as much value from that. So ultimately, what we're trying to do for the modern member is we're trying to get them as conscious as we possibly can in the experience. Because if you look around the landscape of the people, in any hospitality environment these days, you can see the bulk of them actually sitting on their phones, being distracted or not being present. And that's actually fighting against our value proposition. That's fighting against the perception of value. So the more conscious we make the person, and that's why people love the big events. That's why they love the big things like Club Champs and the big events and the majors that you all run, because there's a heightened sense of consciousness in that space. They're more conscious in those moments than they are at any normal given day. And the funny thing is, if I ask any of the staff members or the teams, when are you the most ready and the most alive for it? It's in those big events, because also that individual is more conscious at those, in those bigger times, bigger events. So I think one of the things that we need to start sort of asking the question of, and it's great to see the leaders and many leaders in this call this morning, of how we're being very conscious about future-proofing our club's value proposition in the future. Yes, there's always going to be an infrastructural element to that, which is important for us to take cognizance of, but there is also a cultural and a systemic element that we need to take cognizance of. So when we leave our post, what is in place for that continuity to continue on. And with that comes the importance again of the perception of value and human behavior. So I want to share my next little clip with you, and we're going to go back to Rory, which, by the way, one of the most interesting books that you could possibly read is something called Alchemy by Rory Sutherland, the gentleman who speaks now. He was tasked with many jobs of, look, we don't have the budget to improve the speed of the train, in inverted commas, but we need to make this thing more enjoyable. And this is what he's going to speak about now, is how do you go about that? And how do you go about increasing that perceived value proposition sometimes when you don't have the number of noughts you need to make the infrastructural change?
Human behavior doesn't run on objective reality. It's driven by meaning and context. Google, Starbucks, Uber, they're really the product of a psychological discovery, not a technological one. Uber doesn't necessarily reduce your wait time for a cab. What it does is it reduces the psychological pain of waiting because you can see there's a car on the way. That's what changes the game. You can make something worth 10 times as much money simply by tweaking with the brain, not the thing itself.
Well, it's magic.
I think that the whole advertising industry has totally lost the plot, and that it has become obsessed with that part of advertising which is a media and targeting optimization process. If we assume only that our job is to be the best at something, and if we define ourselves by our competitors, we'll be even worse, because we're trying to be better at something that a lot of people are already good at. What's the point of doing that?
Don't be second in a category, invent a new category where you're first.
Exactly. Innovation tends to happen around the edges. The people who successfully innovate are often quite happy to go against the grain, become comfortable with ambiguity. The more ways in which you can look at something, the richer you are.
I must say, I absolutely love his sentiment in that for a few reasons. The first being, and it reminded me of something that Simon Sinek once said when he attended two different conferences, the one being a Microsoft conference and the second being an Apple conference. When he attended the Microsoft conference, the rhetoric, the conversation was primarily about how can we beat Apple? But when he attended the Apple conference, the conversation wasn't about how can we beat Microsoft. It was how can we be better than we were yesterday? And I think from a philosophical perspective, it's incredibly important that we don't limit ourselves by what the competition is doing. It's very important that we're able to see the value in what we have as a unique identity. So a quote that I wanted to share with you in this respect is that the modern member will not join a club purely for infrastructural value. He will join and remain a member because of the psychological value they experience in line with their fundamental needs. And this is something which we need to be very, very mindful of, is that as everyone, in inverted commas, gets the new courts and the new whatever the next thing might be, because I promise you there will be a next thing at some point. The question is not going to be, yes, do they have that? The question is, what is that sense of community? What is that sense of energy that I feel in that space? And maybe if I can give you a different example of what I mean. I don't know if any of you've ever been to some desolate remote place like, and I love it, but going to a place like the Karoo, there's absolutely nothing there. There's no infrastructure, there's nothing. But you go with the right people and you're with the right kind of human beings and you have the time of your life, right? It's as much about the human capital or the human value that comes to the party as it is about the very same fact that I've walked into some of the most amazing hotels you can imagine, and I have felt completely and utterly disconnected to the space. As in, I will not go back there. It doesn't matter how beautiful the woodwork is or the, or the crockery or the whatever, but I'm completely disconnected with that environment. And that's something which we need to be very, very mindful of, I believe, because it is in that, in a meeting halfway that we find the importance of distinguishing the objective reality to, as Rory said, the meaning and the context. You know, a car journey can take 3 hours for argument's sake. But if you're listening to a great podcast and you are enjoying great music, that 3 hours can feel like 3 minutes. And it's amazing how these different notions of perception play into that role. So if I could give you a specific example of what I may be talking about, and Vida did this so brilliantly when they first started. They've lost that sort of unique element a little bit, but why not become the club that's known for the best welcome in the country? Why not be known for an intangible that, despite what happens, despite what the day of the week is, that is the element that stands out in your in the perception of the space. And as I said, Vida did this beautifully, because when they started, they realized that the coffee business needed a shakeup. And what they did was they had the highest degree of energy in the space when you walked into it. And I always remember that, because it's something which stood out. Some people loved it, some people hated it, but the reality was that it was a unique signature, and it brought more people to the space than it pushed people away. So with this concept of, and we call it alchemy, it's almost creating something out of nothing in a sense, because we're not building it out of a raw material, but we're creating this sense of tangible value out of the intangible. Is if we bring it back into the club environment, I want to pose the question to you, and I'm going to give you a little bit of time to think about this, but if you had to look at a basic customer journey, and if you had to look at the modern member and how we understand the perception of value, what are some of the areas in your space, just off the top of your head, where you think you could enhance that degree of value, or that degree of perceived value that is felt? And I'm going to throw it around the room again, because I'd be curious to know just whether you've been thinking about it, and what that element of the journey is that you think, if focused on in an intangible sense, could deliver a significantly increased degree of value, both for visitors and members alike. So I'm gonna jump to Cindy this time. Cindy, I hope all's going well at Danfern.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Good.
So as I said, what if you, and I know I'm asking you off the cuff and off the bat, but what do you think that answer, perhaps in the context of Danfern, might be?
Rob, I think each club has their own unique something or another. Yeah, I anticipate at the moment it would be our restaurants and bar experience, because that's, from a golfing experience, that's ultimately the thing that stands out the most. It's a team that's obviously strong, well put together, and values each and every resident who comes through and knows each one by name.
It's an interesting one, and I think it's possibly quite a popular one, because there are a number of different moving parts in the food and beverage experience. Something which we've always found is the one that scores lower than most, in any form of evaluation, because there are so many moving parts. But secondly, I guess also because of the amount of time that they spend in the restaurant. As you said, it's not just your golfers, but it's the residents of the estate, etc. Would that be fair to say, or would there be any other reasons why you think that's opportunistic area for you?
No, I think that's fair to say, Rob.
Okay, great. Let's compare and contrast that. I'm keen to hear. He's just arrived. Good morning, Mr. Claus. I trust everything is well in St. Francis.
Unmute me.
You're unmuted, sir. And now you've muted yourself.
Here's an interesting scenario. In all my years here, I've never been a fan of the time it takes and how disruptive a halfway house experience can be. And I call it the greatest momentum breaker in golf, is to stop at halfway. And yet, obviously, some courses are known for a great halfway and a great stop. But to me, the one thing that's kind of amazed me is that why isn't it slicker and quicker and more personal by just giving the halfway a heads up before you get there? I've had a phone system in place now for years, from the 9th and 18th tees. And the reason I do it is if you want your eggs over easy, on the bacon, on the toast, you can have that. And it doesn't have to be just the way it comes. We can actually make it to your liking. And next to the phone are a list of all my members and how they like it. In case there's somebody new there, they get it. So it sounds like a big step, but it's not. It's just a phone. And you just call in and you place your order and you have it the way you like it. That's just one element. But for us to be further away, to be perceived as a difficult golfing test, we have to make the rest of the experience special. That's just the bottom line. We've got to try to touch them at every turn.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. I mean, from your perspective and your experience, if you take the difference in lens between the visitor and the member experience, I mean, you guys are, as you said, a much of a destination in terms of a visitor experience. How do you distinguish? You know, if you look at these touch points, and you say, right, well, X is important for a visitor, X is important for a member. I mean, if you were running a purely visitor-driven environment, where would you be focusing other than the halfway micro experience you just mentioned there? Where else would you be really making sure that you're hitting the nail on the head 9.5 times out of 10?
Well, like was just said, you know, the member experience, in my opinion, is much easier because you know their likes and dislikes. The key to the guest is probably making them feel like a member, and to ascertain what their needs are, and some of that comes with the bookings. Some of that comes right up front. To find out where they're staying, how long they're going to be with us, where they're going to next, and then we can assist. You know, we don't play 60,000 rounds, we play 23,000 rounds, but half those rounds are visitor rounds of some kind. And so we rely on that. And I think my whole team understands, again, a Simon Sinek, why every guest that comes through the door is a potential member. So if everybody buys into that, then I think we're treating the guest properly.
I'm glad you've always emphasized that, Jeff, and I think the purpose element feeds into the behavior and creates more consistent behavior. So it's great that your team has latched onto that so well. Ben, so I'm going to come to you next and just ask you, I mean, you've added complexity to your space, which is the new restaurant and that whole dynamic, which is almost its own entity in a way. Where do you feel that dynamic between the visitor and the member sits for you at Royal? And what touch point do you think is perhaps your next focus? Sorry, Ben, I think you're just still muted there.
There we go. So firstly, when you said anthropology, the first thing I thought was about your golf swing and the last time we played together. So I was surprised at the direction you took. But I think
it's a family show, Chris.
I think like Cindy said, I think, you know, every club's different and we all have, you know, vastly different business models in terms of what we're trying to achieve. But, you know, as you're talking, I'm busy thinking of a story that Jack Nicklaus told me when we built Serengeti. And, you know, when he went through the golf course, everything was about look, smell, hear, and feel. And it's something that I've taken with me over the last 10 years at Royal, that every single part of the experience is about what do people see, what are they going to smell, how they're going to hear, and what are they going to feel at each point. But, you know, for every single club that's offering something different, it's about how can you get that implemented consistently throughout the business. So I don't think we are exceptional at anything at Royal, but I think we're consistent throughout the experience. And so as we kind of scale the club and you know, create new kind of amenities and facilities, et cetera, for us, it's about a guaranteed winner. That when you come to the restaurant, it's about consistency of food, consistency of service, and that personalized experience at every single point. But we also try and look at it and use it to our advantage, because we're clocking on some 70,000 rounds a year. We use personal interaction to control the speed of the experience as well. So Jeff talks about halfway house. For us, we've got guys using halfway house that aren't playing golf, and then we've got the golfers coming in off 2 courses. And so we try to put ourselves at the forefront, not just to enhance the experience, but also to control the pace. And similar to at the restaurant, you know, on busy days, we put live music in place because it distracts the customer from you know, the time in terms of waiting for food and things like that. So I think it's definitely different for every business depending on the number of feet. But the one thing that none of us will argue about is that, you know, the human interaction is absolutely key, and how you make people feel, that's what's going to keep them coming back.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So I think it's an interesting view on it, because I think the consistency allows for you know, that we don't fall foul of that person who comes in and has that that experience which is not quite what their contemporary or their friend said it was like. And often you do find that in environments where there'll be a recommendation for someone to say, you got to go to this restaurant, you got to go to this space. And then that person will go and they'll have an experience that's just lesser than what the recommendation or the talk up was. And I think that's a dangerous thing today, because we are, to phrase a cliche, we're only ever as good as our last experience or our last performance. And that's, loyalty is, other thing we noticed today, ladies and gents, is that loyalty is less and less of a reality. People are not as loyal as they used to be. People will jump, you know yourself as a consumer. If someone hasn't met your expectations in terms of a contractor or a service provider or even just as a customer yourself, you're going to go find the place where you feel you are going to get your bang for your buck. And I think that's something which we, certainly from a visitor point of view, certainly from a corporate client point of view, whatever way you want to look at it, is an important thing to bear in mind. I just want to ask one more person just on this topic, just to get a decent cross section. So Liam, I'm just going to ask you from your guys' perspective, what does this look like, in your particular space within the club?
So definitely, obviously second point of contact for each customer. So obviously through the main gate, they see security first. From golf operations, it would be the customer gets to our person a bag drop, met with a nice smile, so welcomed very, very nicely. Then down around the clubhouse to our staging area. So it's all about trying to touch that person as many times with our staff with a friendly face, and just trying to make sure that they have a great time, have a great day on the golf course. They will be met on the golf course by myself or my assistant, and we try and make sure we keep that expectation from, how do I say it, to keep that customer entertained as much as possible throughout the day. So trying to touch their experience as much as we possibly can, because for us it's about people as well. Making sure that every time a customer sees a staff member, it's a smile on the face and we're having a great day serving you as the customer.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks. Yeah. And I think that's something which we, just maybe some insight from a staffing point of view is I find it interesting. The feedback from a lot of staff very often is that are at the front line, that depending on who's in front of them, even from down to sort of a participation or an influence perspective, is how certain customers influence staff. Some people might be a bit more intimidatory. Some people might be a little bit more conversational. And it's interesting how what typically tends to happen is that a lot of staff mirror the behavior of the of the person in front of them. So if you've got an antagonistic type of customer in front of you, they might fight fire with fire. They might pull back. It's interesting to see how the behavioral change of the staff occurs depending on who's in front of them. And that's something we can also ready our teams for, is to almost be a bit proactive in that sense and know how do we actually deal with this type of personality. And that again is where anthropology becomes such a valuable thing to focus on, is actually being more ready for different types of people. I think you might have noticed in your different clubs, the volatility of customer behavior has definitely gone up. It's definitely increased. And that's something which we need to be aware of. But just bringing it back to the perception of value, ladies and gents, it's interesting that, as individuals, we value things not for what they are, but what they mean to us. And if I look at, for example, brands in golf, you've got an interesting play at the moment between these different brands and how they try and create meaning to the consumer out there. I mean, I'll take myself as a quick example, but I've always been a big fan of a particular brand called Titleist, which most people know about. And I don't know where the clubs are made or how they're made or what the thing behind it is, but I take value in the meaning that the brand has created. And it's interesting because there's not that much intel in that space. In the same way that you might argue that the old course is technically obsolete, but the alchemy of the space has almost kept it relevant. It's interesting how these elements all play into the perception of value and even into the concept of relevancy. What I'd like to chat about next is how the modern member makes decisions. And this is something which is very, very important for us to bear in mind, because this kind of informs how we are going to make the right decisions going forward for our relevancy in this space. So quickly to touch on another point which Rory speaks about is kind of what we were touching on about earlier, but how do you actually take your understanding of what value looks like and actually moving it into the space where there's not just a tangible or an infrastructural answer to everything. There's actually an alchemy-driven answer to everything. So he spoke about the trains earlier, and I just want to reiterate this little clip because it really informs what we're going to speak about next.
And not nearly enough to the psychological ones. You know my example of the Eurostar. £6 million spent to reduce the journey time between Paris and London by about 40 minutes. For 0.01% of this money, you could have put Wi-Fi on the trains, which wouldn't have reduced the duration of the journey, but would have improved its enjoyment and its usefulness far more. For maybe 10% of the money, you could have paid all of the world's top male and female supermodels to walk up and down the train, handing out free Chateau Petrus to all the passengers. You'd still have £5 billion in change, and people would ask for the trains to be slowed down. Why were we not given the chance to solve that problem psychologically? I think it's because there's an imbalance, an asymmetry in the way we treat creative, emotionally driven psychological ideas versus the way we treat rational, numerical, spreadsheet-driven ideas. If you're a creative person, I think quite rightly, you have to share all your ideas for approval with people much more rational than you. You have to go in and you have to have a cost-benefit analysis, a feasibility study, an ROI study, and so forth. And I think that's probably right. But this does not apply the other way around. People who have an existing framework, an economic framework, an engineering framework, feel that actually logic is its own answer. What they don't say is, well, the numbers all seem to add up, but before I present this idea, I'll go and show it to some really crazy people to see if they can come up with something better. And so we artificially, I think, prioritize what I'd call mechanistic ideas over psychological ideas. An example of a great psychological idea, the single best improvement in passenger satisfaction on the London Underground per pound spent came when they didn't add any extra trains nor change the frequency of the trains. They put dot matrix display boards on the platforms. Because the nature of a wait is not just dependent on its numerical quality, its duration, but on the level of uncertainty you experience during that wait. Waiting 7 minutes for a train with a countdown clock is less frustrating and irritating than waiting 4 minutes, knuckle-biting, going, when's this train going to damn well arrive? Here's a beautiful example of a psychological solution deployed in Korea. Red traffic lights have a countdown delay. It's proven to reduce the accident rate in experiments. Why? Because road rage, impatience, and general irritation are massively reduced when you can actually see the time you have to wait. In China, not really understanding the principle behind this, they applied the same principle to green traffic lights. Which isn't a great idea. You're 200 yards away, you realize you've got 5 seconds to go, you floor it. The Koreans very assiduously did test both. The accident rate goes down when you apply this to red traffic lights, it goes up when you apply it to green traffic lights. This is all I'm asking for, really, in human decision-making, is the consideration of these three things. I'm not asking for the complete primacy of one over the other. I'm merely saying that when you solve problems, you should look at all three of these equally, and you should seek as far as possible to find solutions which sit in the sweet spot in the middle. If you actually look at a great business, you'll nearly always see all of these three things coming into play. Really, really successful businesses. Google is a great, great technological success, but it's also based on a very good psychological insight. People believe something that only does one thing is better at that thing than something that does that thing and something else. It's an innate thing called goal dilution. Ayelet Fishbach has written a paper about this. Everybody else at the time of Google, more or less, was trying to be a portal. Yes, there's a search function, but you also have weather, sports scores, bits of news. Google understood that if you're just a search engine, people assume you're a very, very good search engine. All of you know this, actually, from when you go in to buy a television. And in the shabbier end of the row of flat-screen TVs, you can see, are these rather despised things called combined TV and DVD players. And we have no knowledge whatsoever of the quality of those things, but we look at a combined TV and DVD player and we go, ugh. It's probably a bit of a crap telly and a bit rubbish as a DVD player. So we walk out of the shops with one of each. Google is as much a psychological success as it is a technological one. I propose that we can use psychology to solve problems that we didn't even realize were problems at all. This is my suggestion for getting people to finish their course of antibiotics. Don't give them 24 white pills, give them 18 white pills and 6 blue ones, and tell them to take the white pills first and then take the blue ones. It's called chunking. The likelihood that people will get to the end is much greater when there is a milestone somewhere in the middle.
So, ladies and gents, what's fascinating, if you look at all of those examples, is just how we are creatures of logic more than we are creatures of the alchemy. And that's something which, as I said earlier, is such an opportunity for us to tap into. Because if we can improve the perceptive value of our experience, we are operating at a very, very different level. So to kind of decode a few of the things which Rory spoke about so brilliantly, I must say the thing with the traffic lights I found amazing. How beneficial, but how detrimental it can also be if you do it the wrong way around, is one of the first things that he spoke about, which I thought was really brilliant, was this requirement for certainty. So when the person knows what's coming or what's happening, they have a greater sense of calmness, of confidence. You know, if you really break down what Uber has done, it hasn't been a revolutionary technology. All it's done is actually just given us a bit of certainty around wait time. It's exactly what Willoughby's did. They just gave people a little bit more certainty that people were being validated in the space and that they were going to be okay in the wait. So it's interesting how if you break down those touch points, and that's why I asked you earlier, if you look at it from reservations to departure, how much certainty are we creating in these spaces? Even if there is a wait time, how much certainty are we creating? And I think there's a lot of merit in breaking down these nodes, these points of value in our customer journey and going, how do we extrapolate this, but how do we actually make sure that we look after these 4 or 5 things that I'll chat about now? And that's when you can really be certain in your own mind that, as Chris spoke about earlier, the consistency is being met at each of the different touch points. So certainty being one. And if you think about Takealot as an example, you know, Takealot have become very good or much better. If you remember Takealot in the beginning, you didn't get this degree of certainty that you got in your communication as to where your parcel is at the different points. Now you have certainty at each point of, you know, of the journey until it gets into your hands. So we become a little bit more at ease with the process. And as I said, we've got to bring this back, I think, also into the certainty we create in the different channels that we make use of, and make sure that we have that consistency even in those areas. Where if someone had to make a call to your club right now, how long would it take for the phone to be answered? How consistent would that experience be? How many solutions would that person have solved during that call versus deferring the responsibility? It's incredibly important. The second one, which Roy speaks about loosely, is the requirement for variety. So, you know, if you look at the member versus visitor, your member seeks improvement, enhancement in some areas. They seek that variety, that newness. In retail, we speak a lot about, you know, how can we invigorate merchandising? How can we, I'm going to go to what Chris said earlier, but what Jack referred to as, I think it was 3 of the senses, but looking at how do we invigorate through the senses? How do we create that sense of variety? And really what Jack was talking about there, if you think about it, is how do you increase consciousness? So variety creates consciousness, because the worst thing you can do is have someone arrive at your space and all they're doing is they're looking at their phone. They're unconscious to the value proposition that's all around them. Now, if you're a destination, that becomes a lot easier because everything is new. But if you've got people coming back again and again and again, you've got to work harder to get that degree of consciousness going. So, you know, think about the variety that's happened in our lives when it comes to, for example, payments. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, we didn't have all of these different ways to make payments. I mean, that's just kind of happened and we've just sort of gone along with it. But the question is, what's the next evolutionary step in terms of variety? And that's something really important to be curiously intelligent about as we move forward. The third one that Roy speaks loosely about is the requirement for significance, or if you want to give it another name, is the requirement for validity, for people to feel like they have been validated in your space. Now, it's interesting because the higher the degree of need for significance, the higher the degree of need for validation. So if you've got a customer who walks into your foyer, doesn't get any form of recognition, and they've got a high degree of need for significance, and they're a visitor, their psychological state is going to diminish very, very quickly, right? And this is what I showed you on the in the Canal Walk case study, where the quicker that someone got validated, the quicker or the more that their basket size increased. So it's super important that we understand that these touch points play a role, not just in our perceived value, but in the actual rands and cents, which essentially come our way. The biggest challenge that I think a lot of you face in your different clubs is that there are just too many CEOs. There are too many people that think that they've got the best idea. So how do you validate all those different types of people, but then still making the right decisions? I think if you get down to the fundamental level, the reality is that generic communication doesn't create a sense of significance. So just because you term an email, "Dear Rob," and the system in the background takes Rob from the database and puts Rob there, that doesn't create significance anymore. That doesn't create the necessary need for significance, because that happens everywhere. So the only way you really create significance is through the human capital, through the organic behavior that you actually instill from your team. The fourth one, and Rory's spoken about this, and so has Danny today, and that is the requirement for connection, to feel part and to feel affiliated to something greater than yourself. There has never ever been a time when we are technically more connected, but in reality more disconnected. People have never been more lonely than they are now. The need for the quality of macro mental health around the world has never been more poor. And that is because whilst we are digitally connected, we are physically or emotionally or psychologically very disconnected. And that is why clubs have got such an important role to play in this process. I recently joined a Wednesday school at the club that I play with, and it's been one of the best things that I've started to do ever, because the sense of community in that school has got so much associated value to it. And it's beyond just being a member of the club. It's that community within the club that has created that sense of value. And what's interesting, just the last one here, just to add on to what Rory was saying, is what we've noticed significantly in our mystery shopping data is there's been an increased requirement for growth. And what that simply means is, whether it's in the club context or whether someone wants to have that space to grow their or improve their handicap, or whether it's someone in a shop who wants to learn something new about that product, people take an increased layer of value from being able to learn something new about that sector or about that industry. So where we find the opportunity for the modern member to increase their understanding, they then take that back into their spaces and develop or show their community how much they've grown and understood. So where we can educate, I think there's a massive benefit. One of the things which we've noticed is very popular at the moment is educational business breakfasts and things like that, where there's going to be some insight delivered to a member base where they feel that it's just created for them. So those learning opportunities within the club where someone comes in and provides that insight is hugely beneficial to a certain degree of the market. What I'd like to start sort of closing off with in terms of my content before we go to a little bit of a Q&A today, ladies and gents, is just one or two last parting thoughts on how the modern member is actually wired, and some of the sort of trends that we've noticed just on a macro level of consumers in different sectors. I think the one thing which is well known already and quite well understood is that customers are significantly more informed. What we're noticing across the country and across different sectors is that a consumer will come in to the space and to the value proposition, and they'll have a number of the dots already connected themselves. And what they'll actually be looking for is that legitimacy to say, well, look, I'm kind of there, but I need to know whether this element's going to work for me. So our role is changing in getting people over the line rather than giving them the full spectrum or the full understanding. It's important for us to understand how that role changes with greater information. It also means that our staff need to be well versed on what we have to offer, because if they give information which is incongruent with what that person's already learned, then the legitimacy goes down very, very quickly. So it's important that that consistency exists, especially at a knowledge or product knowledge level, as much as anything else. The second one is that today, as we've already discussed, customers are always connected. So the fact that we're always connected means that there is a need for the connectedness to extend past the digital into the human, where people are not getting that connection at the moment. So what we're finding is in the progressive environments, the focus isn't on necessarily just how do we make tech work for us, but how do we bring the human capital in to add an additional layer of tech, additional layer of value onto the tech, so that we don't lose that identity of who we are. The next one is that customers expect personal interactions in terms of the last mile of the sale. So what we've noticed is that 3 out of 5 consumers are likely to buy from a company that has personalized their experience to some extent. So, for example, in that process of understanding whether that person wants to be a member or not, what degree of personalization is being involved in that process. The human factor in that plays a significant role in getting people over the line. Customers won't wait for items they want. So what we're noticing today, again, is that there's a very clear line, and once one goes over that waiting period, people fall away very quickly. And I think we've seen this, whether it's an inquiry for a golf day, so an event booking, whether we've seen that in terms of inquiry for membership, whether we've seen it in any other different space, we've noticed that that purely speaking, people are just not willing to wait anymore. So I think one of the things that we need to be very, very mindful of, if we look at your value proposition from a communication point of view, is what is the worst case scenario wait time across your communication channels? Is there a standard that's set for that? I think it's important that that expectation is clearly communicated across the team. It's very volatile and very inconsistent in terms of what we've noticed according to our data, and it's something which can easily be a unique selling point of your environment. One of the questions I often ask a club when we do some work with them is, if you had to give yourself a score out of 10 for these different communication approaches, what would your average score out of 10 be for each of those? So things like responsiveness, how responsive are we to a visitor making a call to the club? What does our tone of voice sound like when we're on the telephone? Most people have no idea what their tone actually sounds like, because we only hear it when we hear ourselves on a voice note, etc. And then we're quite surprised by the tone. What is the level of product knowledge across the board? How much do we actually know outside of our immediate focus area in our club? I love to go and ask a waiter about who the starter is for the day and see whether they know the name of the starter. It's simple things like that which show the connectedness of a club. And it's something which is very easy to forget, because our member, well, they possibly are never going to ask the waiter that question. But to the visitor, to the person who needs the connectedness, that's where it starts to play a huge role. Patience and problem solving is something which, given today's type of customer, the modern customer, is going to become even more important as we go forward, because we need to have even the human being on the front line able to problem solve, able to own the problem. The biggest challenge, ladies and gents, that we find in terms of our human capital at the moment, the biggest skills deficit across all the sectors we work in, is the ability to own the role and the ability to problem solve autonomously rather than deferring it to a manager. If you can develop those skills, the manager's state becomes better, therefore they manage and lead better, because they're not getting as many things deferred to them where they have to then step in and solve the problem themselves. So I think at a skills level, what is great to focus on is, how do I become more courageous around my problem solving ability, and what are the steps that I can follow to actually make that happen? The last little note that I just wanted to share with you on sort of the customer evolution in terms of behavior is that we are noticing a significantly increased degree of opinionatedness amongst consumers. So people are talking a lot about what they think is the right thing, or that they like or don't like. And because of social media and all of these different platforms today, they're very quick to verbalize. If you just go on Twitter and spend a few minutes on Twitter, you'll see how opinionated people can be, and they'll at that company straight away and they'll say, I'm unhappy with this. I'm a victim of, or I'm not a victim, I'm a perpetrator of that as much as anyone else. If I'm not getting what I was expecting from that company, I will go onto Twitter and I'll ask them the question, because I know that's where I'm going to get the quickest response. Funny enough, that response is coming quicker on Twitter because they're managing their reputation on Twitter, not just coming back to serve the customer. So it shows you sometimes the true identity of a business when they're very quick to respond on Twitter, but they're not as quick to respond on an email. So to be careful of the reputation or the messaging that you're putting out. If you're fast on the social channels, but you're very slow on the emails and the things that don't get seen in the public, it's important that we understand the difference between that. I'm gonna end today's content with a little word association exercise. I'm going to ask you to give me a one-word perception, if you would, on the following companies. So I'm going to ask you just to write them down for me, and I'm going to go through about 4 or 5 different companies. You've probably had some dealings with these before in your life. So I'm going to ask you just to give me a one-word answer. And in fact, what we'll do is we'll put it in the comments box because I'd like you to see everyone else's responses as we go along. So I'm going to ask you just to write the name of the company as you write it, and then your one-word answer as your perception of the environment. The first one is this. So just write the name for me and your one-word reflection of it. If you have never had any dealings or you don't really have much to do with them, you can put indifferent. So just quickly name and your one-word perception of that business. John puts phone. Bongi puts expensive. or just the tennis fine. Jess communication. Cindy pricey. Jessica overpriced. Happiness weak network. Right, let's move on to the next one. I like that, Liam. Vast for Vodacom. Uber's, Daryl says innovation. Paul says clever for Uber. I like that. How does easy? I assume you're talking about Uber then, not Vodacom. Right, interesting, ladies and gents. If I had to put Bolt on there as an alternative, I'd wonder how different that answer might be. It's interesting to speak to the drivers and see their difference in perception of the two. Right, for the sake of the fact that we are in a World Cup year, ladies and gents. Oh, love it. Paul says praying. Paul, you and me both. I assume you may be talking about Sia there as much as everyone else. Only strength of our country, says Jess. I can't argue with that, Jess, at the moment. All right, let's do the last two quickly. Value, cheap, affordable. Interesting. Funny enough, ladies and gents, for those of you who don't know, I've actually got someone I know very well who works in the DCs at ShopRite. And funny enough, the technology that ShopRite have developed as a result of their volume actually puts them a good 4 or 5 years ahead of the likes of Woolworths and Pick and Pay because purely of the volume that they've had to develop. So on the front end, they're perceived as being the entry-level brand, but on the back end, they're actually by far the most advanced from a logistics point of view. So the last one, and not to end on a negative, but I do need to ask the question. All right, I didn't expect much difference. Right, indeed. Save us indeed. Ladies and gents, it's interesting to see the difference between those answers again, not so much on the last one, but it's definitely on the first couple. And really what I was trying to achieve there is just for you to see again on this small sample size, how perception does change depending on the lens through which you look at the reality. I think one of the things which I want to bring back to you is always remember how important it is that the perspective of your club, of your environment, is not just one, it's many, and depending on the lens through which is being seen, is looking at it, it's going to be different. We want to try and speak to as many of those lenses as possible all the time, knowing that that person who chases two rabbits often catches none. So it's important that whilst we try and be everything to everyone very often, it's important to remember that that often is very, very difficult to achieve. I just want to end off today by also just stating, and if we think about what Danny Meyer has said, if we think about what Rory has said, it's very, very safe to focus on the tangible asset or value that you're all building and all have been building so beautifully over the last couple of years. But what I do also just want to stress is that as the modern member evolves, as the consumer evolves, it's important for us to think about what is the perception of that value, what is the community we're developing, what is the intangible value that ultimately becomes a tangible positive on your balance sheet. So ladies and gents, thank you for listening. I hope it has been informative. I hope it's maybe changed a few thoughts around what becomes focus, because where our focus goes, our energy flows. Charles?
Awesome. Thank you so much,
Over to
Rob.
you.
Great as always. Guys, any questions? While we've got Rob with us, if you need to ask any questions, please, you're more than welcome.
Candice, I haven't heard from you this morning. I trust everything is in order and the training is going well in the lead up to the big day. I'm gonna take the nod as a sufficient yes. Paul, are you also running?
No, just maybe a comment stroke question around, I guess our industry is slow at using technology, and we really don't have, it's such an important part of business these days, and using technology to help us in that, and we really don't have the best, and we look around and try and find better ways of doing things in that. And I'm not taking a swipe at Jonas or any of the other things, but for such a big worldwide industry, we lack in a lot of areas, and stuff isn't easy. And I don't know whether it's just because we generally aren't tech savvy, or there's no money around it, or whatever it is in that. But I do think it is an opportunity to use tech better to help us.
Yeah, Paul, I think it's a very important point that you mentioned. I think Chris is probably going to want to jump in there as well. But I think the reality is, and I'm seeing it slowly but surely, not in massive ways, but slowly but surely, there are a couple of new players coming into the space, and people that are seeing value in providing something for the golf industry. And I think what's important is that we keep an eye out and we support those players who aren't the big players, but as they get more clients and as they develop themselves, become a legitimate business in their own right. I think the important thing is to realize that the bigger the entity or the older the business, the less likely they are going to be to change with the times. And that's quite a sort of a high level sort of assessment of it. But I do believe that the newer guys are more willing to understand the modern needs of the environment. Chris, I don't know if you've had first-hand experience. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I've just been through an interesting experience of changing banks. And I think, Paul's obviously right. You've got to keep abreast with technology and make sure that you've got it all going. But to the same extent, I think what's more important is that you need to keep that human connection going. And in my experience now with changing of banks, I think I moved from FNB to Investec, and everything with them is a personal phone call.
Yeah.
AI call center, everything has no connection, and my experience with them has been unbelievable. I mean, it would take me 3 weeks to change my password with F&B, and now it's amazing the experience that I've had. And so, you know, we've got a policy in the club that, you know, when we've got a disgruntled customer, member, or, you know, a kind of tough situation, we're not allowed to respond via email. We have to phone them, we have to invite them for coffee, we have to go see them for coffee. And we've found that by kind of, you know, taking a step back and making sure that we keep that human connection versus using technology works far better for us. I think everything in South Africa, the kind of abnormal becomes normal. And so you can't just be focused on one thing. But at the end of the day, playing off those human senses and talking to somebody over coffee or, you know, just that personal connection, I think it goes a long way.
Yeah, Chris, I think you hit the nail on the head there. And also in the sense, I mean, if you take a look at Investec's the culture, what they've been so brilliant at doing, actually also to add on to your point is their succession. The way that they've brought in the family environment into their primary members is also very, very clever in talking about looking after the future of their business. You know, it just shows you how culture, and I'm not the first to say it, but how culture trumps strategy every day of the week.
Awesome.
Right, who have we not heard from this morning? I know we've heard from Pods over there, but Jeff, are you're surviving there? Are things going? You're happy with the tournament you recently hosted? Are all things well in St. Francis?
As long as you don't subscribe to News 24, I think we're doing great. I think the bottom line is every club, it doesn't matter who you are, is always going to get an attack from the outside, or people are going to pull at you from different directions. But at the end of the day, what it showed us, that we had a small group of people that wanted to attack, and the 92%ers of the rest all stood up, and it actually bonded our club more than it ever has been. So we don't have a perfect world that we run here, and all of our shareholders live right here. It's not an annual meeting, it's a daily meeting. So I like what Chris just said. I just had to go into the home of one of my members who had conflict, and I went and saw him, and I made a big difference by diffusing it personally rather than thinking we got to back it up with an email. So I just wanted to say, as I said in a point right now, that you gather the best in the business on a webinar that you do, Rob, and I've now known you for 10 years, and I think what you put together is just amazing. So I don't have a question, I just have a comment, and that is keep it up. And I think you reach more people this way. And I think you've presented it very well. So I appreciate it.
Thanks, Paz. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. I just wanted to make sure that that everyone had a voice. One of the things, maybe I'll ask you in a separate little podcast interview, Pods, is that shift that you've made over the last couple of years to from being a largely secondary home environment to a lot more primary home environment, because I think there's a lot of lessons to share from that and how that change has happened. But we'll maybe leave that for a separate conversation. We can touch on that. I think there's value in that. I haven't heard a lot from you yet. I just wanted to check in and see how things are going your side, and all things being well, I hope.
Oh, thanks, Rob. Always a pleasure listening to you. Always a pleasure listening to Jeff and Bentley and Paul and the boys. It's always nice to hear from the guys who've been in the industry for a while. And just take away from this meeting, I mean, what Chris said there now, the personal note when you have conflict. I think that's so important, and I definitely wrote that down today. That's something I will definitely work on going forward. Rather have a personal conversation with someone than rather sending an email. Now, just funny enough, we redid our halfway house. We spent quite a bit of money there because we felt it was just not flowing. The service was not up to scratch, and the equipment was old, and it's made a huge difference. It gave the members something to talk about. It's always nice to have positive things coming from members rather than negative. Membership for us, it's not always easy. We sit in quite a difficult area. We've got quite a few golf courses around us, so we have to be unique in what we do. We do have a unique golf course, but it's also challenging. Funny enough, I saw Gavin van Wyk, the guy that was posting on Twitter. He wanted to play on a few courses. I think there was only a few of us that answered him, And funny enough, he chose our courses, but what you did better than me, you actually greeted him personally. And I was very upset that I didn't think of about something like that. But well done, Chris. You definitely beat me there. But it's always also nice to see that people actually, especially on Twitter, I think it's been great since Elon Musk has taken it over. I love Twitter. I love the communication that's there. I love the people's got a voice now. Yeah, Chris, well done there. And Jeff, yeah, it's always nice to see your course on TV and the tournament you guys are hosting. I love St. Francis, especially when the wind doesn't blow. But other than that, boys, Rob, thank you very much for a very informative session. And I know two of my guys, John Woutberg and Freddie and Charlie, also joined in, and I'm sure they also took a lot away from this. Thank you, guys, and I'm proud to be part of CMASA. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Aldous. Appreciate the words and the sentiments. Guys, there's been, just to end off, there's been a lot of, and I don't want to take away from any of the wonderful infrastructural work that has been happening at the clubs. There has been some significant, and a lot of you have lost a bit of hair or got a few gray hairs like I have for the project that has to happen for that to become reality. And we must always be cognizant of that. But I do, and I'm very excited about the marriage between infrastructure and the alchemy that we spoke about today. Guys, if there's any other questions or any other feedback, as Charlotte said, it's always hugely valuable. So please do pop any feedback onto that link. And
awesome.
Yeah, we enjoy these conversations as much for the two-way street as hopefully I've shared with you. So thank you to all of you for contributing. If I haven't gotten to you today, my sincerest apologies, but would love to hear from all of you at some point. Charles, over to you.
Awesome, guys. Yeah, just before you jump off, as Rob said, please, feedback valuable to us. So please, if you could spend a couple of minutes and just complete that form for us, and as well as the registration form. We are not going to be able to acknowledge you with CPD points, etc., etc. If you do not fill in that form, please. It would be great if you could just fill in that registration form. Enjoy your Tuesday, guys, and see you guys soon on our next webinar. Have a great day,
everyone.
Thanks, boys. Awesome.
All the best.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers, man. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.